one thing that I would like to bring in, especially because you talked about my background. I've worked in the business field, in the public sector as a journalist, now in the civic society sector. I think one thing that I realized when working in all these fields, we tend to get stuck in the position that we have sometimes, and I think one of the first steps that we need to take in order to be able to create systemic change is to step out of our own role for a little bit, So I encourage you all right now to just take one step while you sit or while you stand, take one step where your foot out of your present role and just try to kind of open up to other people in the system, and think about how is it if I'm a funder, how would it be for the beneficiary if I were just a little bit more open to putting myself into the shoes of the other person. So I think, and I can share a personal experience, I used to have a quite important job in the winter tourism industry in Austria, and I was invited to lots of events. I was part of an alumni meeting, an alumni club. But then when I went to the civic society sector, I wasn't that important anymore all of a sudden, So it was so interesting to see that I wasn't invited to certain events anymore because they considered me as being someone who now asks for money and who isn't in a kind of powerful position anymore, And so if we think about systemic change, I think we need to look at, and systemic funding, we need to look at the different actors in the system and see what kind of mindset shift and role shift do we need. Not only the funders, but also the beneficiaries and other actors in the system. And I think one of the first things that we found out when we set up the Embracing Complexity report, and Hannah was so kind to share that before everybody beforehand, what we did when we said we wanted to create a report about how do we create systemic funding, what we said is we need to include all other actors. So we included social entrepreneurs. We asked them in conversations. We also included Co-Impact. We included Skoll Foundation, McKinsey, so the business sector. So in order to create something like that, an Embracing Complexity report about how to change and shift funding, you need to take a first step and include all the actors in the system, and then come to shared understandings, So I think that's one of the major things we learn also from Ashoka Fellows, from the social entrepreneurs. Something that you can do is to empower the ones that normally do not have the power. And we had this one question here, for example, so how can we shift the decision-making power to our beneficiaries, for example? If we look at this question, it's interesting that I believe, and it was also from Carsten, I think, in the chat, who said that funders should not only fund systemic initiatives, but they should fund systemically. And what does that mean? It means that you shift the power dynamics, that you, for example, include, and this would be one answer that I would have to this question, to include the beneficiaries, to include the poor ones, basically, the ones that are in the power dynamic further below, that you include them in the decision making. And that, for example, what hasn't happened so far, but if we look at the boards of foundations, what if we bring the beneficiaries into these boards, into the advisory boards, and try to have them share the decision making with the foundation members? So that would be one element that we should change, I think. And one example that I also have that we initiated, for example, in France, was that we worked together as Ashoka with different foundations and social entrepreneurs, and we created Racine. So all of you who speak French know that that means the roots. And so how do we look at the roots of problems? And we have one wonderful example now that, for example, the Fondation de France, who consists of lots of foundations, they now created a task force to see how can we create systemic change within the foundation. And I think that's a beautiful example of how to create change from within. It always starts from within, right? And one other example that I have, I consider myself to be quite competent in terms of system change, but I did a test, a self-assessment test. It wasn't that good, to be honest. So I really have to learn more, And what I can offer is a course that we have as Ashoka, a system change course, an open source course, where you can learn about system change. And I think what we really should do is acknowledge that we possibly not have so much competence in this field, many of us. or not enough competence, and we should, really learn something about system change together with the beneficiaries. And Lauren said that we should look at the power dynamics. So how can we create this power dynamic towards more of the beneficiaries? I think that's another important element. What I also think is, I come from the business sector originally, and what we have there is a supply chain management. And I was wondering, what about the topic of certain system change that we want to create in terms of longer term engagement and in terms of working in true partnerships? How can we create a kind of possibly a kind of supply chain management for certain systemic changes that we want to tackle? How can we make sure that certain foundations come in at certain times, and which kind of beneficiaries, which kind of organizations that work on certain topics can then be there in this kind of supply chain, if you know what I mean. So that would be another idea that I would like to share with you. And what I love is, for example, the Hill Foundation in Austria created a strong participatory process of finding their beneficiaries and trying to work together with the beneficiaries in a participatory process. And I think that's one element that's really important, that we create this shared understanding of systemic change that we want to achieve. And there was another question about the imbalance, the imbalance of the relationship between grant givers and grant seekers, and also in terms of the leadership. So for me, it's so important that we, for example, Marie and I, in the leadership of Ashoka in Europe, we have to be the persons that really bring this change to our own organizations. And the same should be in terms of the leaders of foundations. I think they themselves need to represent systemic leadership. Is there any other question that I wanted to look at? Lauren said, for example, no shortage of solutions. I also believe that we really don't have a shortage of solutions, but we need to look at it systemically and see what we can do within this system, which kind of actors need to apply certain systemic change principles. So just some ideas about how to shift the sector of foundations and the sector of systemic funding, building up on the learnings from Ashoka Fellows. Thank you.